Hello, hello, and good evening. My name is Liz, and I'm a Kaplan MCAT teacher. I'm so thrilled that you've joined us this evening. We're going to be talking about secondary applications, and you may have heard a lot of different information out there. And we want to make sure that you know what you can trust, you know how to be best prepared. And in this delayed season of taking MCATs, really how to think and how to plan for secondary applications. And to that end, we are joined by Maria Loftus. Hi, Maria. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Liz, and welcome to everyone out there tonight.
So Maria, why don't you tell us just a little bit about yourself and that can get us started.
My name's Maria Loftus, and I used to be the Assistant Dean for Recruitment and Admissions at the University of California, San Diego School of Medicine. I was there for about 20 years, really enjoyed myself, worked on a number of committees for the Association of American Medical Colleges, including the Committee on Admissions. And a couple of years ago, I retired, and now I get to work with clients one-on-one here at Kaplan, and I like that even more than I liked being Dean of Admissions, so it's great.
That's awesome. It's always fun to work with students one-on-one. So this is why we're thrilled to be here. Maria has a wealth of information to be able to share with us. So let's start from the very beginning, and let's pretend, Maria, that I've never heard of secondary applications. So walk me through that timeline, and what are they like, and what am I expecting to happen this summer if I'm applying?
So, back in the old days, every medical school had their own application. And so when people were applying to medical school, they had to fill out many applications. And then the Association of American Medical Colleges, for their member schools, which are all of the MD schools in the United States, with the exception of the public schools in Texas. So all of the US MD schools, many of the Canadian MD schools, and of course also mainland Puerto Rican are all members of AMCAS, which is the American Medical College Application Service. And then the osteopathic schools are a member of their application service, which is ACOMAS, and the Texas public schools for their service. And so you fill out a primary application, which goes out to all the schools that you designate that you want your application sent to. And then the individual schools send you what is called a secondary application, because it is smaller than the primary application. And it's asking you for things that are very specific to that individual medical school. And typically what it's mostly going to include is your individual essays that the schools ask you for. And from school to school to school, typically it's going to be 2 to 3 additional essays. At the secondary level, when they're screening your essays, that's also going to be the time when they're looking at your extracurricular activities and your letters of recommendations, all of which are part of your primary application. They just don't get looked at until a little bit further down the line.
So that makes sense, but how do you think that might be a little bit different this year, given that a lot of folks aren't going to have their MCAT scores until much later in the cycle than in a typical year?
So today, most medical schools send secondaries to all applicants. So they're not pre-screening. They want to be able to look at your application a bit more holistically. So they want to see those letters of recommendations. They want to see your responses on those additional essays. This year, even those schools that have historically pre-screened, of which the big school system was the University of California, all of the medical schools have historically continued to pre-screen and only send secondaries to a fraction. Even we are saying that this year, because so many applicants will not have MCATs at the time they file their primary application, that the medical schools are going to go ahead and be looking at applicants in a more holistic manner, which we are interpreting to mean that they're going to be sending secondaries to everyone. But honestly, we don't know until it actually happens. And this year, the primary applications through AMCAS have been delayed by 2 weeks. So While applicants have been filing their applications, AMCAS will not send the first bunch of validated applications, applications that they have checked for accuracy. They won't send that first bunch until July 10th. And at that point, we'll know for sure, what all the schools are doing. But what they're saying suggests that virtually every school in the country will be sending secondaries to everyone if they actually have a secondary. And there are a few schools in the Texas system that only use the primary application, but everybody else has a secondary. And so, if your application goes, you've been notified by AMCAS, ACOMAS, or the Texas system that your application has been delivered to the schools, you can expect a secondary within a week. For many schools, it'll be immediately. And honestly, there's also a small chance that you'll get a secondary from some schools that you're applying to even before they've received your primary application this year.
And I guess a really good question is coming through here, kind of talking about timing for submitting secondaries, what's considered early, normal. But before we get too far into that, let's talk about what that communicates. So if, let's say July 10th, and then so let's say the 17th, maybe I can expect to get secondaries, and I'm snowed under. I've got 20 schools that I've now got secondaries for. How do I think about what I'm communicating to those schools if I reply in 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks?
So many medical schools, well, every medical school, when they send you the secondary, they're going to tell you what their deadline is. And for some schools, I would say the majority, it's a 2-week deadline that they give you. That's historical. This year, maybe they're going to be a little bit kinder, given that so many people will be taking their MCAT exam sometime in July or August. But again, we don't know what they're going to do. So we'll just go on historical. Historically, the more typical is 2 weeks, but there are schools, of which mine was one, that our deadline was November 1st. So anytime between the time you got it and November 1st, if you sent it in, we would process it. So the thing is that even if the school says that you've got months to return your secondary, if you haven't sent it back within about 2 weeks, chances are you're going to get a letter from them, an email, saying, "What? You don't like us? How come you're not sending your secondary back?" So you do feel under some time rush from the school. You're feeling that. And here's the other thing is that, to review a secondary does take a real live human being. Parts of that process can be automated, particularly your activities can be somewhat automated in how they review it, simply because it's all the information, all the bits of information are coming electronically. So it's pretty easy for the school to run a program, a computer program, an algorithm that's looking at how many months did you do it, how many total hours did you do it, what was the classification that you gave it, so they can do some preliminary review. But at the end of the day, a real life human being has to sit down, read the essays, read your activity descriptions, read your most meaningful comments. And if a school has thousands and thousands and thousands, my school was getting 8,000 applications. If we sent secondaries to everyone, and 8,000 is not unusual, a lot of the big schools get that many. If there's 8,000 people who've been sent secondaries and you're waiting until after you've taken the MCAT, so August or September, to return your secondary, there could be literally 2, 3, 4, 5 or more thousands of people ahead of you to have their secondary reviewed. And given that a real life human being has to sit down and review those, it can go from being a couple weeks that you're waiting for your application to be processed, the secondary application, 2 months. And if it's months, all that time, interview slots are being awarded, and beginning October 15th, acceptances are being awarded. So it really can become very stressful for you, particularly this year if you're also juggling MCATs. And I've got to tell you, your MCATs remain, as always, the most important thing. So you've got to do well on the MCATs. That's more important than getting your secondary back in a timely manner. But once you do have the time, the bandwidth to sit down and start looking at your secondaries, then it's figuring out, how are you going to prioritize them? Are you prioritizing them based on your top schools? Are you prioritizing it based on commonalities? Where are the overlap in essays, so that maybe you can get a couple done fairly quickly because they have real common essay questions? Or is there some other priority list that you want to give? But just know your summer's going to be really busy. You're going to be doing a lot of writing. Right now, nobody's traveling. Typically I would be saying, forget your summer vacation plans. This year, you may not have summer vacation plans, but just know that all your secondaries will come very tightly grouped together, and you're going to have to figure out in what order you're going to do them and get them back as well done, but as quickly as possible.
Well, we have a great question. Does all this apply, in your experience, to the ACOMAS application cycle as well?
That's a great question. So my experience, both in terms of working with clients and a recent ACOMAS webinar that I attended, where they had admissions officers from other schools, from ACOMAS schools, their member schools, talking about the timeline. I had always presumed that their timeline was as time sensitive as AMCAS has gotten to be. And one of the things that a director of admissions said, and none of his colleagues contradicted him, this person said, you should be getting your primary application in a timely manner, because by September, that particular school has received about 50% of their applicant pool.
Oh, wow.
That is so different than the AMCAS schools, of which almost everybody applies in June. And so almost all of the applicant pool comes in June. So with ACOMAS, it is a little bit more paced out. And I certainly have had clients who have not gotten their primary application in to ACOMAS until September, and they went on to be admitted. In terms of the secondary timeline, I don't know that they're any different than the AMCAS schools. That schools will give you a deadline, and you want to get it back as quickly as possible. So I'm not suggesting that you should wait until September or October to get your ACOMAS application in. Certainly get it in when you've completed it. But AMCAS remains the more time sensitive, so I would say work on that one first. And when you're done with submitting your primary, if you're not doing other things, you can start working on your ACOMAS primary. If you aren't able to get your ACOMAS primary in until after you're done with your AMCAS secondaries, I think you're fine if you're submitting in September.
Let's talk about why secondaries, right? We do so much work in that primary application. There's activities already on there. There's the 3 most important activities. There's a personal statement. There's a lot already that they have. So
why do they need more?
Right, exactly. Like, what is this all about? Why do they need to write more stuff?
So, that's a great question. And it was a question that we dealt with on the Committee on Admissions for the AAMC, because part of our job was to vet, should the application have more to it? And, there are things that some schools are interested in knowing and things that other schools aren't interested in knowing. So, we really work for what are the common issues, the common questions that schools have. And to the best of my recollection, the last time there was really questions that were added had to do with all of the socioeconomic questions that are asked currently. Prior to that, it was the felony questions, misdemeanor questions, academic integrity questions. And so it's got to be something that all the member schools really want to see. So that it's only so long, and there's going to be questions that a school thinks is really important that they don't get to ask. So that's where the secondary, any questions that they're asking. And like I said, typically it's an essay form, but not always. And last year, I saw some very unusual secondaries involving that you were supposed to do videos and multimedia projects, and it was surprising. And I hope that this year that nobody adds to that burden. If the world is uncertain enough, let's not add, to see how creative can a school get with their secondary, to send it out to you. But there were a couple of multimedia type secondaries last year.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think one of the questions that a lot of folks are going to have is like, okay, so how can I be prepared for this deluge? Are there sort of categories that I can expect to see questions from? What are some ways that I could at least brainstorm some concepts and kind of get ahead of this a little bit?
So if I were to say, again, historically, we don't know if things are going to be different this year, but there were certainly a couple of questions that show up a lot. One is, why are you interested in our school? Why have you applied to us? And unfortunately, largely, that is a question that has got to be personalized. Your response has got to be personalized back to the school. Why are you interested in them? And what they are saying, they typically phrase it as, why did you apply to us? But what the real question is why should we care about you? Why should we consider accepting you? And you don't want to answer with, well, you're a great medical school. They already know they're a great medical school. That is not going to, it's really not stroking their ego, because they already know that. And it's not okay to say, well, you're the medical school in my state. Or God forbid you say, hey, you're located right in my hometown and I can continue to live with my parents. And I have seen people make that response. That is not a good response. So you want to really be looking at their mission statement. You want to be looking at their curriculum. You want to be looking at things that that school is proud of and how it fits with your background. Because if you're going to say, I'm really excited about your school because of the opportunity to do A, B, and C, and there is nothing in your background that suggests that you're really interested in that, then you just look foolish. It looks very superficial. So hopefully, when you've selected schools that you're applying to, you have considered fit, and you've written yourself notes as you were deciding which schools to apply to, and you've written yourself those notes as to why were you excited about the school, and maybe you put in the web link so that you can go back and refresh your memory, and you can speak to how and why are you a good fit for that school. And I will say, I have seen people effectively argue that a reason that they were interested in going to a school is because they don't have some experience in their background that this school presents. And they're saying, I want to live in a different part of the country. I want to see more of America. I want to experience, the heartland if you're coming from the coast. And that is a respectful thing to say, but again, it fits with your background. So that's one very common question. And it's also a common interview question. So you gotta know why you're applying to a school. And it's not that the GPA and MCAT profile fit your profile. Another really common question is, how are you going to add to the diversity of the class? That is in the broadest sense of the word of diversity. What is it about your interest in healthcare? What is it about where or how you were raised? What is it about your undergraduate major? What is it about your personality? How and why are you adding to the diversity of the class? We as educators care so much about ensuring a dynamic learning environment. And one of the ways you do that is you have people that are coming from different backgrounds, different experiences, different perspectives. Another reason that we care about diversity is also that we are producing physicians for all of America across, research, public policy, primary care, subspecialties. So we are very interested in, what are you bringing to the table that might be a little bit different from the student sitting next to you? A third question that can really throw people is, what else do you want to tell us? With no direction. Now, if they haven't already asked you about why you want to go to the school, that's how I would answer that question. Unless there is something really specific that you think needs to be addressed, that you need to tell the school that you haven't done already. But assuming you've addressed all the important things in your application, your personal statement, or in one of those other questions like, have you been subject to an academic disciplinary action? Have you received, have you been convicted of a misdemeanor or felony? You get an opportunity to respond to those questions in text, to write about what happens. So assuming that all that important stuff has been already dealt with in your application, and you're not quite sure what to add, how to answer that question, if they haven't already asked you why you want to go to the school, that's where I would use that spot. If you've got more to say about why you want to go to that school, then even if they've asked the question, you might have additional things you want to talk about in greater detail. If you still, that's all done, you're fresh out of ideas, then my personal suggestion is think about your personal qualities, your personality traits. Is there something about you that you want the admissions committee to know? Was there a sport or a musical instrument or artistic, or, I've had people write about that they're a gamer and how and why they think that eye-hand coordination is going to be important in their future career. I've had people write about being an introvert and how they think that makes them a good listener, but because they want to be the doctor and they know it's going to be their job to put their patient at ease, the efforts that they've made to overcome being an introvert. I mean, it's not that you ever overcome it, but at least you can fake, being an extrovert. I've had people, write about a fear of public speaking. But again, that as a physician, they know it's going to be important for them to be able to be the one out front. So think about, is there something that, is part of who you are, And it's either a strength that will help you as a physician, or it gives you a little bit different view of the world, or it's something that you've worked to do better at.
Well, I hear a lot of resilience, right? A lot of opportunity to communicate, overcoming, and also some self-reflection. So saying like, I recognize this about myself, and this is how I would like to grow in that. So I think that's a great tack to take. I think there's also humility in that, right? So it's saying like, I didn't hang the moon. And so, we all have those areas to grow in. I know that one of those things that could easily pop up in some of these questions is COVID-19. And so I'd love to ask you, like, how do you think that could be asked? And sort of how do you think that students should strike, like what kind of tone should we strike as we're, sort of discussing that?
Good question. So in the ACOMAS application, they actually did modify the primary application this year to ask about COVID-19. And they had 3 questions that they added. One was, if you are in school, did your school move online, classes move online? If so, was pass-fail grading an option or mandatory? If it was optional, how and why did you choose to either take pass-fail for some courses and not others? And then the third question is the longer, more character count in terms of your response. And it was, how have you personally been affected by COVID-19? I would expect that a lot of schools, MCAT schools, because the primary application did not change, but I would expect that a lot of medical schools will ask a COVID-19, and it's going to be along the lines, how were you affected? So you answer factually, how were you affected? Did your school move online? Were you or family members personally affected, either because people lost their jobs or because someone got sick? So speak factually. And so the factuals, a couple of sentences, not emotionally, not, I was burdened in a hardship and it was, terrible. Just speak factually, and then immediately move into, what did you learn? How did you grow? How will this make you a better doctor? That is the underlying theme for everything you write. What did you learn? How did you grow? How will this make you a better doctor? And so from that standpoint, it ends, the overall feeling of your essay should be the cup half full versus the cup half empty. It should be a positive reflection of, life is a learning process. Everything that happens to us is an opportunity to grow and be better. And that's what we're looking for in a future physician.
And we have a great question, just, and you and I have talked about trusting online information. So this one is saying, I've read online that, if you're taking the MCAT August, September, that basically just punt to next cycle, right? Like, don't even try to apply this cycle because your chances are so low, even, unless you're that 99th percentile person out there with the perfect everything. And so, with all these cancellations and so many people getting pushed back, do you think that that's going to be true this year, that any dates past July, they should just move to next year? Or do you feel like they should move ahead for this summer in this cycle?
That's, again, a great question. I'm so glad that somebody asked it. This year really, from our perspective, isn't that much different than any other year. Yes, I fully appreciate that from your end of things are way more stressful and uncertain and hard to plan for. And you may have had research that you were in the middle of that got canceled. You may have clinical experiences that you were in the middle of that got canceled. My response is, unless you were applying as an MD PhD student, whatever research project you were in the middle of, the fact that it got canceled isn't going to make that much difference to a medical school, because you're not representing yourself as someone who wants to be a research physician. The extent to which we like to see research, for the most part, it's that we just like to see that you've done some research. So you've been in a lab, you've had this experience. If it was a future experience that got canceled, well, we don't know that things aren't coming back. And we don't know that you won't be able to complete it this year. If it was a clinical experience that got canceled and you don't already have prior clinical experience, I guess I would say to you that every medical school is going to wonder, what are you doing putting off your clinical experience till the very last moment when you're applying to medical school? You know, if this is what you want to do with your life, we would have expected that that's one of the ways in which you would have tested your motivation much earlier than, the month before you're turning in your application. If it was, other things, if you think the fact that something has been canceled is going to make you less competitive, I guess I would say, yeah, and it probably would have made you less competitive in any cycle. So you might want to take that gap year. You might want to push off your application a year, because from our perspective, when you come to us, we want you to be, as we always said in the office, we want you to be fully baked. We want you to be ready. We want you to have tested your motivation, done those other things you were curious about, gotten a job and paid off debt, pursued an ulterior potential career, that when you come to us, you're now fully sure and fully ready to be applying to medical school and starting medical school now because you're ready. So by all means, we look favorably upon the concept of gap years. Yes, we're going to ask you, so how did you use your time? And why was that a good use of time for you? And there's a million and one reasons for that. There's no right answer. It's why was it good for you to do this? And so don't feel that you're under some artificial timeline or artificial pressure that you've got to apply this year because that's what you always thought you were going to do. If you're not ready, then wait, because you want to put forward your best application when that time comes. This is an expensive process. It's expensive emotionally, it's expensive time-wise, it's expensive monetarily. It's an expensive process, so you don't want to have to do it again. So if you're not ready to do it now, wait a year.
What would your response be if you had a student who, let's say, had all that, felt strong, but the one thing that hasn't happened is the MCAT, and they were just randomly assigned into August, where they didn't get a chance to really choose to take it earlier? Would that impact what your recommendation would be?
If you are studying well, you are feeling, I appreciate right now it's June. In August, you may just be starting to study. But if you have been historically a strong standardized test taker, you've got a plan for how you're going to prepare. You have no reason to think you won't do well when you test. I see no reason to postpone your application.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think and we've said this at other times, that just remember that this impacted thousands of folks. And so, I think really hear Maria when she's saying that, if you feel like anything other than your MCAT, you're good to go, please do feel free to move forward. And I think all the schools are on your team. They're not against you. And so I think the one caveat as an MCAT teacher I have to say is still really make sure that that MCAT study time happens. I know a lot of people are in suboptimal places for studying right now. And so you just want to make sure that that doesn't get delayed by everything else that's going on this summer if you do decide to go ahead and apply. I think there's some great questions we got earlier about kind of what are common mistakes that you see students making, and how can we prepare to avoid those mistakes as we're going to be turning these in.
I think the most common mistake that I see people make on their essays is just fatigue. And what I mean by that is, if you're the typical applicant applying to about 20 schools and you've got 2.5 essays per school, you're looking at 50 essays to write. And you've got to fight the urge to repurpose an essay for another school without being sure that your response is appropriate. So there's the obvious mistake people can make, whereas they just forget to change the name, of the school. That's somewhere buried in their essay. They say something like, so I am so excited to go to, medical school X, and they're sending that essay to medical school Y. Absolutely happens. And, gosh knows, I've certainly sent emails myself that way where I'm cutting and pasting and I have missed, changing a name. So I get it. I get how that happens, but that's the obvious. But it's also making sure that you're not giving some generic answer, or you're not giving the answer to the question you wish they had asked, as opposed to the question they did ask. So I've got clients right now that are trying to pre-write secondary essays. And there are websites out there that compile prior year's prompts. And there's no guarantee that a medical school is going to keep their prompt, but for the most part, schools don't change their prompts often. The caveat, of course, being this year, who knows what's going to happen. But historically, prompts are kept for any number of years. So they're trying to pre-write, and they will send me, their draft and say, am I in the right direction? And sometimes, yeah, they're good. Sometimes I'm writing back and I'm saying, well, the question was, what do you think, the healthcare issues or, whatever it is, here's the question, then here's what they asked you to respond to. What do you think? What would you recommend? What do you think is the most important? It's make sure that you have answered each of those sub-questions. Or I'll get a draft that it's really not specific to that school in that region. If you're applying to a school that's in an urban area versus a school in a rural state, and their question is, what do you think are the biggest healthcare challenges? What they are going to think is the biggest healthcare challenges are going to be probably two very different things. And so it's remembering who your audience is. So again, it's being specific to what's the question and who's asking it. And so you can only go so far with repurposing an essay across multiple schools. And so those are the biggest mistakes that I see. There's also the obvious in terms of make sure there's a theme, make sure it's coherent, make sure there's no spelling mistakes. But those are things, most people get. You've got your editor through all of your word processing programs. And so for the most part, that's cleaned up. It's more that it's not asking, or it's not answering the question asked for the audience asking it.
we had a question earlier about the situational judgment test and just any advice for that in California and Minnesota schools this year.
So this is the AAMC's response to the Casper exam. So it's very, very similar to the Casper exam, except that it's specific to medical schools as opposed to the Casper, which you might get a medically related ethical question, and it might be some other type of ethics. There are only 2 schools that are using it this year. It's still part of the beta test. It's unknown whether or not it will be expanded in the future. The schools aren't, sure the extent to which they're going to use it as part of the admissions process. All of that said, you still need to take it seriously. And it's not a trick question, but it will typically take you through, like 4 or 5 questions within a scenario, and they build upon each other. And you've got a fixed amount of time in which to respond as to, what do you think is important? If you've gotten to this place in life, you have developed certain life skills, certain decision-making processes, of how you would decide to approach something. And so just answer it. It's not really something you can study for. You do want to, hopefully, you don't have to hunt and peck as you're typing. There is a second part that they're working on that doesn't seem like it's going to be used this year, and that's an interview, standardized interview that was also used to be part of the Casper. So they've broken it apart, and it's only the situational judgment test that I'm aware of being used this year. And again, it's only 2 schools that are using it.
We have another great question, just saying, if we're at that stage of choosing schools, is there like a right number of schools to apply to, or is there a range that you often suggest that your clients apply to?
The average applicant, I think, currently is applying to 18, 19. I always just round it up and go with 20. And certainly I've had clients that, send me a list of 50 schools that they're planning to apply to, and that's just ridiculous. I mean, you should have intentional thought as to why you're applying to a school. You're within their range, their academic profile, if it's a public school, that you are a student that they would consider accepting. Many, many public schools accept out-of-state students, but some of them have a very limited profile of who they will accept. Like I always hear people say, I want to apply to the University of Washington. Well, yeah, so does everybody. And University of Washington says that they accept out-of-state residents, but only if you're a medical scientist training student, an MD PhD student, or you're part of the Witchy Whammy program. I mean, really, that's the only people they're accepting. So choose intentionally. And you cannot respond to 50 set of secondaries and do a good job. So I think 20 is a reasonable number. And I recommend to everyone that they give serious consideration to also applying through a COMAS and applying to maybe a dozen schools through a COMAS, but you're pacing out your application so they're a couple months apart, so you can get done with the allopathic schools first, the more time sensitive, before you turn to those other applications, the secondaries to do. Because again, ideally you want to do this once and you want to get in. You don't want to have to do this again. And there's no such thing as an applicant who's going to get in everywhere. So no matter how strong an application is, if you only apply to a couple of schools, and a couple, like 6 schools, I often am talking to reapplicants, And I know the only reason they didn't get in is because they limited their net. Their net was way too small. And you might think, well, if you can get into one school, why can't you get into another? Even if you're within the academic profile, how we evaluate the primary application, every school makes up its own equation. Every school decides what they're going to look at and how much weight they're going to give it. And while, there are very broad generalities of, yes, we're all looking at your GPA, we're all looking at your MCATs, we're all looking at the undergraduate school you've attended. But beyond that, it's how do we do that? Are we weighing each academic year differently? Are we only looking at a particular grade? What are we doing with the MCATs? I know of a school that only looks at one of the subsections as opposed to all of them. So we all do things differently, and we don't share with you what we do. So you do need to have a broad net to ensure that you're applying someplace that's going to look at your application in the most optimal light. But to go overboard is also a recipe for failure, simply because you're not going to be able to do a good job on all those secondaries. So 20-ish.
That's helpful, I think, for a lot of people. And one of the things we were talking about maybe last week, you were mentioning, maybe you hear from this student, they checked out this website or this Reddit or this, whatever it was. Kind of, as we get stressed out, I think a lot of us go to the internet, right? We want to find answers, we want to find solutions. How do you suggest we think about different information sources and, whether it's trustworthy, worth our time and stress that it might be causing? Can you kind of speak to that a little bit?
One is, I would go to those sources that in the past you have found to be reliable. So if that's your university's pre-med office and their website of questions they have compiled and they have responded to, if you have been happy with the advice you've gotten, there's your trusted source. Go to AMCAS, go to ACOMAS, go to the TMDSAS, the Texas system. That's an official source. In particularly AMCAS website, the AAMC website is incredibly rich, very, very rich in information that's there. Come here to Kaplan. We work really hard to make sure that the advice we're giving is not inflammatory and is accurate to the very best of our knowledge, our experience, our background. People who go to Reddit in particular, I have clients all the time who are saying, oh my God, I just read this. And it's almost like, the old-fashioned game of telephone. Each person wants to kind of up the ante with, but I heard somebody say, this, and they expand a little bit further. And I've also heard clients say that they suspect that sometimes some of the advice you get out there are people trying to sabotage the competition. So try not to, go back to those sources that you have found up to this point to be reliable. They're going to be your reliable sources going forward.
And then tell us a little bit about the use of these secondaries as we move towards interviews. A little bit of the timing again, kind of if things go well, and then sort of what that span looks like, and then how they also get used.
So as soon as the secondaries start coming back, the schools start reviewing them. We can begin interviewing whenever we want to begin interviewing. Schools typically have started towards the end of August, September, and then we can begin accepting October 15th. We don't have to, but that's for outside of early decision, that's when we can begin accepting. And I'm talking about the AMCAS schools. ACOMAS has no fixed dates that say you can't accept prior to this date. And the Texas schools, you go through a match. So all three systems are different. So from school to school to school, we all turn everything, all of your qualities get turned into points. Not that we're trying to make you a number, but because there are not enough adjectives in the dictionary for us to keep you all straight. And so we turn things into points. The primary difference in terms of how that system works from one school to the next is that either it's a running total of points of which you're accruing and you hit at each stage, you've got a new subtotal. And so your academic review got you so many points. You add to that the secondary, which is your letters, your activities, your essays, if they're scoring essays. Those points get added together and the people with the top points go on to be interviewed. The other way of doing it is that schools will normalize at each stage, meaning the people with the best academic points are the ones whose secondaries get the most serious look. And but then their academic points disappear. And so now it's going to be just the secondary. The people with the best secondary points go on to be interviewed, but then everything disappears and it's just the interview points that will determine who goes on to be accepted. So ours was the running total of points, which means you're carrying all your strengths and weaknesses with you. That if you've got a really strong strength, you might be able to offset a weakness. In the other way of doing it, as long as you squeaked by, all weaknesses, all strengths disappear. So again, depending upon your particular bundle of qualities, one of those processes may work to your advantage better than the other one. But that's how you get to how do we decide who's going to be interviewed? You know, at the end of the day, it's still, you know, the people who've made it to that stage looking the strongest.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting. Well, I know there are going to be a lot of different types of questions as we've talked about, and there's going to be different constraints. I know we had talked about some are kind of 250 words as the response. Are there ones that don't have limits, or is there an upper limit that you've seen in terms of length on some of these secondaries?
To the best of my knowledge, ours was the longest at UC San Diego, and at least up to this year, you know, we asked for an autobiography and we gave you 2 pages. So that would be roughly in the 8,000 character. And to the best of my knowledge, working, you know, with clients and seeing their secondary essays, I've never seen another school that was longer than that. I don't think that's as hard as doing you've got 500 characters to answer what on the face of it looks like a pretty significant question. You know, and there's so much more you want to say or more nuanced in your response where you just can't do it if it's only 500 characters.
And what would you say to someone who's in that situation? Kind of how do they process down to be able to fit those challenging limits?
Well, you start out, I think, with what you think is a full response, see where you are character-wise, and then start cutting. And the cutting is, what are the essential points you want to get across? Everything else gets jettisoned until you get down to the character limit. And, you know, particularly with those small character limits, the expectation is you're going to use every single one of them. You know, even mine at the 2 pages, we're talking, you know, it was an autobiography. We're asking about your whole life. If somebody only wrote on one side of the page, we wonder, you know, don't you have more to say for 20 years or 25 years of life? So while you don't have to use every character, you certainly want to use, in responding to any question, something close to 90%, unless you truly, you this question really doesn't apply to you, in which case, that may be your answer. And I have seen that occasionally, but most of the time you can respond, and you should be using at least 90% of the characters.
Well, that's great. So we've got one question here we can kind of wrap up with. We're kind of talking about that idea of out-of-state students being accepted, and kind of how do we figure out whether it's worth applying to. Kind of, we're looking at MSAR, we know what the percentages are. Is that a good gauge? How would I know if I'm an out-of-state student, how to gauge a school, like whether it's worth applying to or not?
That's a great question. So the MSAR is so great. There is so much information there. And if you are looking at the entire individual school profile, so you go onto the link that links you to that school's profile, and you scroll down to almost the very end, it will start giving you where are the accepted students from, what states, how many of them were there, and you can start to figure out what your odds might look like. You can also, look at some of the other demographics to help you identify if you look like you're a student that they're looking for. So if you're looking at the state residents, and they say that they admit, let's say hypothetically it was 20% of their class was out-of-state residents, but you see that the majority of them are clustered right around the state as opposed to where you're located, then you have to appreciate that they're not going to accept you unless you bring something to the table that is better than what they've already got in their state. So they're not going to make exceptions, to make an exception to be accepting you, because none of us have to accept any out-of-state residents. You need to be better. And so I would say that means that when you're then looking at mission fit becomes more important, as well as the academic profiles, that you're probably going to want to be in the 50th percentile or above, as opposed to being throughout that bell curve. And like I said, mission fit is going to get even more important.
Well, thank you so much, Maria, for all of your help this evening. I really appreciate your time. And I guess one of the things I wanted to just think through with everyone as we're walking away is really just think through the resources that are at your disposal. When we're thinking about preparing for your secondaries, you've got all the school's websites themselves, any of your own pre-med office resources. You have MSAR, which is a great database of all of the different medical schools and all that data that Maria was just referring to. You also have things like the core competencies that are listed. And so these are character qualities that are going to be skills and character qualities that are going to be associated with being a good physician. So we can incorporate those words if you're not sure what to write about, what else can you say about yourself, or you need some new direction. And I think some of the things that Maria pointed out, about free writing. And one of the things I often tell my students is that writing is a skill. And it may be a skill we haven't used in a little while, depending on what classes you've been taking. So even if the work that you do over the next couple of weeks isn't directly applicable to some of these questions, you're still waking up those skills and working on writing and communication, which is always going to be so important. So we do wish you the very best as you apply this summer. Please reach out with any questions that you have. Know that we have wonderful folks just like Maria who can work with you on these one-on-one. You can always reach out and ask us. We'll be back this summer. We'll be talking about interviews together in just a few weeks. So we've got some other great opportunities to get your questions answered as well. So once again, thank you for joining us and have a wonderful evening.